Solidigm IPO time, Marvell Teralynx ramps up and CXL news, totally insecure boot, VMware makes everyone admins, DigiCert underscores certificate problems, and we take a look at Microsoft's promise of resiliency in this episode of the Gestalt IT Rundown. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Gestalt IT Rundown. Today is July 31st, 2024. I hope that you all enjoyed a fine bowl of shredded wheat this morning because it is National Shredded Wheat Day. It is also the birthday of one of the greatest literary heroes of all time. I am, of course, talking about Neville Longbottom and some Potter kid. I don't know. I hear he has books about him. But someone who has tons of books about him in the storage industry and many other fine areas is, of course, my co-host, Mr. Stephen Foskett. Stephen, welcome to the show.
You know, Tom, I think it's interesting that you picked shredded wheat instead of jelly beans because it's National Jelly Bean Day, too. And anyone who's ever had a Jelly Belly will know that shredded wheat tastes like shredded cardboard.
Yes, but unlike normal people, I subscribe to the Potter Longbottom fan fiction of don't grab the earwax flavored jelly beans because let's be fair, shredded wheat already tastes like earwax, so I'm getting all of those calories as I can. But the low calorie news that we have for you will leave you satisfied and fulfilled for the rest of the afternoon. So let's jump into our first story. SK hynix is considering a US IPO for Solidigm, which was spun out of Intel in a $9 billion deal. Now profitable after 12 quarters of not being profitable, Solidigm has developed a successful line of enterprise and AI SSDs. The IPO could help fund SK hynix's $6.8 billion HBM plant in Korea, which is slated to start in 2025. Now, we have to stress that this hasn't been officially announced, but everybody's pretty much been expecting this for a while. Stephen, you're pretty familiar with what Solidigm's been doing over there. How does this look for them to have an IPO?
Yeah, this is an interesting story for many in the industry. I know that you may not have heard of Solidigm as much, but they're a big player in enterprise SSDs, especially. Solidigm is the company that came out of Intel's former NAND flash business. Intel had been involved deeply in SSDs, as well as, of course, the Optane business, which we've spoken about quite a lot here. But this is not that. This is the NAND flash SSD business that Intel had, which was actually really solid. I mean, Intel was known as one of the better players in the space. They made really excellent products. We're talking not just the kind of SSD form factor that you might find in a PC, but PCI card, PCIe SSDs, as well as modern extended form factor SSDs. You might have seen some of these things that the new servers are using with long and skinny ruler-shaped SSDs or little thin flat ones that use PCIe instead of SAS to connect. It really has a great product line. They've been really a leader in QLC, which is the most dense NAND flash that is seen in the market right now, which means that they've been able to ship drives up to 60 terabytes in one drive, which is pretty cool. This has made Solidigm kind of the vendor of choice for big enterprise names in storage. So basically, if you are buying a product, an enterprise storage system, or an entire solution, let's say maybe an AI stack, there's a real good chance that the SSDs in that came from Solidigm. Now, the history of Solidigm is a little confusing because essentially what happened was when Intel got rid of their NAND flash business, SK hynix, which was a big memory maker in Korea, decided to pick it up. And they have now, well, for a long time now, we've been wondering what they're going to do in order to kind of set all this right, because SK is more known for their memory unit. And memory and flash are similar technologies, but they're actually different enough that it really doesn't make sense to have them kind of merged into one company, especially because the development cycles of memory and flash and the buying cycles of memory and flash don't always intersect properly. The memory business is a funny one, and it has long been a battle between some big players. SK really is a leader there as well with their high bandwidth memory. chips that are widely used in AI systems. And so it makes sense that they would spin off their Solidigm business in an IPO, especially now that Solidigm is profitable, which is not something you can say about some of the companies in this space. So, although they haven't officially announced it, the rumors sound strong. The analysts are telling me that they're hearing favorable reports internally, sort of whisper reports that this thing is really going to happen and that this would be a major move in the industry. Essentially, we would have a strong new storage player that's well funded and floated on the stock market. And we would allow a strong memory player to continue to focus on their core market as well. One of the only questions that we have about this, honestly, is which assets Solidigm would end up with. Like I said, there's not as much overlap between memory and NAND manufacturing as you might think. But one of the big overlaps, of course, is the factories that they use, as well as some of the other key products that sort of cross over. And it, depending on how that gets divvied up between Solidigm and SK hynix, we could end up with either a very successful result or a less successful result. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on this. We do expect an announcement of this IPO to come very, very soon. And like I said, I don't see a situation in which this doesn't get announced. Marvell has a new fast cat on the market. The Teralynx 10X switch is a 51.2 terabit beast that is aimed at AI networking. It has some of the lowest latency on the market, along with lower power consumption and programmable features. The Teralynx also runs the open source Sonic operating system, which Marvell has backed for a number of years. In addition to AI networking, large cloud providers are interested in the high speeds and low latency of the Teralynx. For more on this news, let's turn it over to Futurum Group Research Director Ron Westfall.
Thank you, Stephen. And yes, this is, I think, a very important announcement. Marvell is spotlighting that the Teralynx 10 51 terabit Ethernet switch is entering volume production for global AI cloud deployments. The new switch is low power, programmable 51 terabit Ethernet device with breakthrough, I believe, low latency and performance for training, inference, general purpose compute, and other workloads to scale accelerated infrastructure in cloud data centers. Now, Marvell's Teralynx 10 Ethernet switch offering enables the clean sheet architecture vital to ensuring cloud data centers can fulfill the unique demands of optimizing AI clusters. I find the offering delivers such fulfillment, providing intricate and robust balance across low latency, programmable, high bandwidth, and low power demands to assure an AI cloud switch that minimizes compromises. Now, AI calls for deterministic low latency to ensure higher performance compute across accelerated infrastructure fabrics that use many connected processors to meet specific workload demand. This means low latency under any conditions is key to predictable fabric performance. The low latency Teralynx switch can give cloud operators the ability to reduce operating expenses and to increase their capacity for performing revenue generating activity. Marvell needed to launch the new product to deliver all critical power consumption advances. The new Teralynx 10 delivers up to 50% lower power consumption in relation to the Teralynx 7 gained from the Innovium acquisition on a watts per 100 gigabit basis. Marvell's power-efficient architecture credentials are further bolstered through its portfolio-wide 5-nanometer process capabilities and independent validation of Marvell power consumption outcomes across typical 520-watt power scenarios. Now, as testament to the company's growing influence in the market shift to open networking platforms, Marvell has been an active member of Software for Open Networking in the Cloud, or simply known as SONIC, and they hold a governing board position and seats on multiple committees, including chairing the Platform Working Group. In addition to the Teralynx switch launch, other contributions from Marvell include SONIC running on ARM-based systems, which are aimed at lowering customer TCO by eliminating expensive hardware components and reducing power requirements. Now, from my view, the deployment readiness fully aligns with the industry's shift to open operating system software seen in the growing presence of Sonic across the network OS realm, as well as Linux across the server OS realm. Now, open software is key to enabling deployment flexibility for hyperscale network deployments that can assure faster deployment cycles, multi-vendor interoperability, rapid supply chain scaling, and, of course, freedom for proprietary lock-in. Overall, I believe the Marvell Teralynx 10 Ethernet switch delivers that low latency and low power combined with high bandwidth and programmable capabilities that is needed to optimize architectures for AI and cloud network demands, which then can assure customers use a comprehensive hardware software solution that, again, fully aligns with the cloud AI shift to open networking. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for that, Ron. Sticking with Marvell for just a minute, they've released a new line of CXL 2.0 products under the Structera brand, which is bringing additional memory to servers for AI and cloud workloads. The line includes support for up to 4 terabytes of DDR5 memory, as well as intriguing offerings that enable customers to reuse DDR4 modules in modern servers. Stephen, you have done an entire season of utilizing tech that completely focused on CXL. So I'd say you know something about it. What is your take on this news from Marvell?
Yeah, this is, well, first off, it's great to see a solid CXL 2.0 announcement here from a big company like Marvell. As well, let me give you a little background here in case you didn't listen to the Utilizing Tech season focused on CXL. Essentially, this is a technology that breaks the strict structure of a server and allows you to have memory separate from CPU, addressed over PCI Express. In some cases, that memory could be pooled or shared between multiple servers thanks to CXL 2.0. But really, the low-hanging fruit for CXL was the idea that you could fine-tune the amount of memory of a server and not be limited strictly by the number of memory channels and the ranks of DDR DIMMs on each channel that are built into the server. Because that's a big problem. If you're trying to build a server, you want to have the right amount of memory. Memory makes up, in some cases, more than half the cost of the server. And it really is challenging. If you need a little more than the small amount or the medium amount, you have to kind of go to the next level, which is a huge investment. Really can break the whole process of buying that server. CXL would let you add basically an additional tier of memory that can be addressed by the server just like regular memory. And it would allow you to fine tune how much memory you put in that server. So these two lines are really great. The Structera line, the high-end line includes the ability to have DDR5 memory. You've got 4 DDR5 channels. It also has a ARM Neoverse CPU on it to manage that memory. And that really can help basically fine-tune server memory while maintaining pretty high performance there. But I'm actually interested in the little guy here as well. The Structera 2404 allows you to attach DDR4 memory to modern servers. Now, this is key to me. This is a very cool technology. So if you're out there in the market, DDR5 DIMMs are fairly expensive. As I said, they're more, it's hard to match the amount of memory that you need. But even the DIMMs themselves are expensive and sometimes hard to find. In many cases, companies and especially large ones, hyperscalers and so on, have old DDR4 DIMMs kicking around, or your suppliers might actually have surplus DDR4 DIMMs that they're not really sure what to do with anymore. Well, the Structera would give you the ability to use those DDR4 DIMMs with modern servers, which means that you could buy a large amount of cheaper memory or reuse memory you might already have and add that to a modern server as a lower tier of memory. The Structera allows you to create, to have multiple channels of memory, multiple ranks of memory so that you can get decent performance out of it that kind of maybe not matches direct DDR5 memory, but looks pretty darn good. and build big memory servers for a lot less money. I love the product. I love the concept. I love the technology. And I'm really going to be watching closely to see if this thing catches on. Really a neat product. Tom, one of the biggest advancements in computing over the last 15 years has now been invalidated. Secure boot, which uses cryptographic keys in the UEFI firmware, what we might call BIOS, to prevent unauthorized code execution, was found to have been completely compromised on over 200 different device models from a variety of big name manufacturers, including Dell, Supermicro, and more. The reason for the compromise is that the platform key, or the root of trust anchor, was published to a private GitHub repository back in 2022, and this wasn't really noticed, well, except that it probably was. Researchers at Binarly found that the key was just a 4-digit passcode, and they were able to crack it pretty quickly. This provides the means to create a PK fail, a proof of concept that shows that secure boot is effectively dead on the affected servers. Tom, what's your take on this big story?
My take is that this is a huge problem that just keeps getting worse the more we dig into it. So you mentioned that UEFI and BIOS are kind of similar in most people's minds. I mean, it's the thing that makes the computer start up and then go beep, right? Well, BIOS is as old as computers. Like I can remember updating the BIOS on my MS-DOS machine. One of the reasons why we moved to UEFI back in the 2010s was because it gave us more extensibility. And one of the things that it allowed us to do was secure the boot. And that was through a combination of things like trusted platform modules and stuff like that. And, there are big companies like, IBM and Dell and, some other agencies like the NSA that really love the idea of securely booting computers. I mean, who wouldn't, right? Because if you can get into the system's BIOS and do weird things to it, you can effectively have a foothold on that computer forever. Because how are you going to get a rootkit out of the BIOS? Wipe the BIOS? Yeah, I've done that before. The computer's dead, just dead. What happened was, and the researchers at Binarly didn't really do any attestation on this, so they don't know if it was an accident or on purpose. They're leaning toward accident. Somebody published the platform key to a GitHub repo that didn't have any labeling on it, right? Like it didn't have a big neon sign that said root of trust key, right? But one of the things that I learned all the way back at Security Field Day 1 from CyberArk was if you publish keys on GitHub ever, they're compromised. Just assume that as soon as you hit enter and go, oh crap, it's compromised, because there are bots that are out there constantly scanning for these things to be uploaded. Things like AWS API keys or shared secrets or things like that. And then they just hold them and then they try them everywhere. If you've ever gotten a random password reset, that's one of the things that they're trying to do. Or, you're the recipient of a $200 million Amazon bill for a month because they used your API keys to spin up a whole bunch of stuff. But anyway, what happened here is it was protected by a 4-digit password. So basically it was broken within hours. And this means that I can't invalidate the existing instructions. Like that's not how a root of trust key works. What makes it more insidious, though, is that I can use that root of trust key to sign another key to insert into a UEFI system so that I can now execute my own code using that key and it won't trigger any warnings. So I'm not going to remove what's already there, but I can add a whole bunch of extra stuff that you don't want to see. Now, here's where it gets worse, though. If you dig into the article that we linked from ours, while Binarly was doing some research on this, they discovered that a whole bunch more manufacturers have a bunch of keys listed in their UEFI secure boot systems that are tagged with things at the beginning in giant capital letters that say do not use or not secure. And it leads to a much deeper conversation that we all need to have about what happens when you create engineering or test keys and then just leave them in the code because you're lazy and it's easy to do that. I mean, thinking about this from a purely security researcher analyst perspective, every key for every type of device at a minimum should be unique, randomly generated, should be trusted, but no keys should cross over. That's that pollination thing. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, log into your iCloud password manager today, and when you get the pop-up that says that you've reshared this password on multiple different sites, that's that, right? If I shared it somewhere, then that means there's a possibility that it could be used somewhere else. That's a password that I can change. These are keys that are almost impossible to change because they're rooted in the hardware. And in order to change those keys, I have to reissue that hardware. Well, how many of you just go out and buy a random new motherboard? You don't. So these things are stuck. And, the GitHub problem is big. Like, I'm not going to deny 200 plus different device models that now have invalid root of trust keys. Big problem. It's the other ongoing stuff. We have got to get smarter and better about protecting these cryptographic keys. You don't just read out your password to people. And this is worse than that. So I think the device manufacturers, the people who make this UEFI stuff, because actually it all traces back to one company, AMI. If you've ever done any work with BIOS, you know AMI. They're one of the only three people who actually make this stuff. They've got to get better quality control, but that doesn't come from you or me. That comes from the companies that use them. So you need to put pressure back on those companies and say, get your stuff right, or we'll go to one of the other companies and get it right for you. VMware by Broadcom is looking at yet another major issue with their ESXi hypervisor this week. And this one comes with a really entertaining setup. If you've already gained domain admin access to Microsoft Active Directory network and your ESXi hypervisors are joined to that domain, you can gain total administrative control over all of them by adding any user on the domain to the ESXi admins group. Wait, you don't have one of those groups? No problem. Just go in and create that group, and the hypervisors will automatically add everyone in that group as domain admins over that hypervisor without checking anything. Now, how could this possibly go wrong? Well, one of the things that you can do if you have admin access over a hypervisor is encrypt all of the virtual machines running on it. And we have seen over the last 6 months that a lot of ransomware crews have used that as an exit strategy once they've gotten what they want. They encrypt all of the VMware systems and off they go. Stephen, this is not good, is it?
No, this is real bad. This is one of those things where you just look at it and you're just kind of shaking your head. As you said, if you have an ESXi hypervisor that is joined to a domain, an Active Directory domain, and if you create a new domain group called ESX admins, and you add a user to that domain group, that user instantly becomes a admin, full admin privileges in ESX. And that's really bad. Like you said, this has been used already by ransomware crews, but honestly, it's way worse than that, because we've seen a lot of cases where intruders, hackers, bad guys have gotten into Active Directory domain controllers. This is one of the areas that they often target initially when they're penetrating a corporation. They'll try to get admin rights in Active Directory because it allows them to do a lot on the Windows side. But the fact that they can then use that to cross over into the ESXi side is a real challenge, because they could then use this to do kind of anything. Once you're an ESX admin, you can actually do pretty much anything. You mentioned encrypting the data. Yeah, you could do that. But you can also do things like exfiltrating the data. You can clone and copy. You can reconfigure. You can delete. You can spin things up, spin things down. You can basically do anything you might imagine you could do as an ESX admin. And that gives a lot of opportunity for somebody to basically run rampant within a system. The fact that multiple ransomware gangs have been already running rampant in the systems using this exploit is deeply troubling, because that means that they've been able to do this all over the place for a while before this was uncovered by the good guys. I'm glad that this is being addressed. Broadcom, by the way, has already issued a fix for this. I'm sure the fix was one line. Hey, don't look for that ESX admins by default. But I think that there's a broader question here, which is, who thought this was a good idea? How come this was hard-coded into ESXi? Now, it does make sense for an ESXi infrastructure to trust Active Directory in order to do authentication and authorization of users. But it really doesn't make sense for it to be looking for a standard hard-coded domain in Active Directory and then trust that. This is, let's say, not rocket science. And I'm surprised that that whoever coded this had that in there in the first place. I'm surprised they left it in there, and I'm surprised nobody noticed this until now. Well, nobody on the good guy side noticed this until now. So yeah, this one's pretty bad. On the other hand, it affects only ESXi. More advanced VMware users probably aren't going to be running afoul of this. And frankly, if you already have an ESX admins domain that you've been using, well, it affects you too if somebody gets into your Active Directory. But if they don't, well, they can't do this. A final challenge, of course, is that you already have to have both a domain access, Active Directory domain access, as well as an account in the ESX server. So, there are some limiting factors that keep this thing from just being mind-blowingly horrible, but, it's pretty bad. DigiCert has issued a statement yesterday stating that certain users have 24 hours to get new certificates after it was announced that some of them were going to be revoked today. The reason might be one of the craziest typos ever. In short, DigiCert allows you to verify control of your domain by creating a special DNS pointer record with a random number. By rule, the record must begin with an underscore character. DigiCert said that code that added the underscore to the pointer record was cleaned up at some point, and the random numbers that were issued didn't have the correct character. As this violates the rules laid out for checking the authorization for a domain, those certificates must be revoked. DigiCert says that only about 0.4% of customers should be affected by this, but that their domains will stop working until new certificates are issued. Now, 0.4% sounds like a small number, but it can be a large number when it's 0.4% of a lot of domains. Tom, how damaging is this?
It's not damaging to the internet in general. It's more damaging about the fact that there's so short a notice. But here's the thing. This is how this thing is supposed to work. Like, we've talked all this years about like things like certificate revocation lists and how nobody uses them because they just take forever to query. DigiCert's doing the right thing here. These certificates, by rule, violate their policies and must be revoked. How many of you out there knew that underscores are not valid domain characters? I do, thanks to my homeboy David Bowerman, who once spent 23 hours on a Microsoft support call upgrading an NT4 to Windows 2000 domain because of an underscore. One underscore caused that whole call. They're not valid. And specifically, they're not valid if they start a DNS name. You have to start a DNS name with an alphanumeric character. Okay, point of that. So the way that DigiCert authorized you to have this domain name, one of the ways that they did it was they said, okay, go in there and stick a CNAME record in and start it with an underscore. And we're going to send you like this random, 150-bit number. And if that number appears with an underscore in the front, you have control of that domain and we will issue you a certificate, right? It's pretty simple. The problem, of course, is that if you look back in their code checking, somewhere in the last 5 years, they cleaned up some old code. And you know that thing called the smoke test where you unplug something and you see what smokes? This was one of those things. They removed this code that automatically added an underscore to the beginning of any of those numbers that were generated. The problem was that nobody along the QA path figured out that the underscore was missing, and their systems would automatically validate those numbers when they didn't have an underscore in front of them. Again, you're doing a policy violation, and the reason why the policy exists is because even though you are generating a number randomly, there is every possibility that that subdomain may already exist in the organization, and it may be automatically validated with a certificate. So it's a security hole. Just trust me, it's bad. But here's the deal. They should have caught this. Like, if you read the Register article on this, it's absolutely hilarious because my snarky brothers across the ocean nailed this perfectly. The QA checking at DigiCert on this one makes Crowdstrike look like experts. That's their quote, not mine. I like that this is something that they decided to do. It's boring, pedantic security policy procedure, but it needed to be done. The only problem is they only gave people 24 hours to get it done. And 0.4% of all certificates that they've issued is still thousands of certificates. So a lot of people are going to be logging into the dashboards today trying to figure out what's going on. I found out about this about 3 o'clock yesterday, thanks to my friend Sam Clemens. But like, this is one of those things that there's a reason why you should be notified when these things happen, is because that's going to be a lot of work for people to keep their domains up and running. But it's part and parcel of what we do. Now, if this was like a CRL thing, like certificate revocation lists, we'd automatically know that they were going to be revoked, and we would have a process for automatically getting new ones and validating them and things like that. It's a headache, right? And we already had to deal with that before with CrowdStrike. I'm sure there are probably people that are still trying to remove that from systems, and this did not add to the pile in a positive way. So I'm glad it happened. I just wish that there was a longer timeline, or especially for something that legitimately is not as big of a deal as these other things. Maybe they could have given people 72 hours or something like that. Speaking of other news, we have a closer look that we wanted to take this week, and it has to do with Microsoft and some of the fallout from CrowdStrike, because they finally released an accountability notice after that whole outage that happened. And according to this particular release, which of course we have linked in the show notes, Microsoft is going to change and innovate in the area of end-to-end resilience. Now, how are they going to do that? Well, they've already started by introducing things like VBS enclaves, which require no kernel mode drivers, as well as Azure Attestation, which determines secure boot postures. If you read between the lines in the release that Microsoft put out, they see kernel access as their biggest issue, and they're going to try to develop new tools that eliminate the need for it, which is kind of interesting when you think about it, considering what we talked about last week and how they're blaming kernel mode drivers for what happened to the big outage that affected, now we know, way more than 8 million machines. So Stephen, we talked at length about the outage, but I want to talk about Microsoft's response to it. They basically said that the way forward is to get things out of the kernel. What do you think about that?
Well, I think they're right. We're done here. No,
that's a show, folks.
I think that there's. I think that they're right in that they have to get things out of the kernel. That's what other operating systems are increasingly doing. That's one reason that the CrowdStrike outage didn't affect Mac and Linux systems the same way. And I think that a similar outage would be less likely, but still possible, on other operating systems. And as we discussed a few weeks ago with the whole was CrowdStrike really caused by the EU directives to Microsoft discussion, I don't think it really was. I think that's kind of a cop-out. CrowdStrike was responsible for this, and their poor QA was responsible, and the fact that they didn't test these things before rolling it out to millions of customers was a really bad decision. But what do we do going forward? Well, clearly Microsoft has a strategic path forward here, which is to move products like this into a virtual enclave within the operating system. The VBS enclaves leverage hypervisors, their Hyper-V hypervisor, and allows extensions like this to run in a hypervisor environment that can be more easily cleaned up and fixed in the event of an exploit, but also that will keep the core operating system from falling over if it falls over. This is a practical way forward, but let me say, I'd love to talk about this maybe a little bit later. The way that Apple is doing it is very different, and actually probably superior as a long-term solution than just shunting this all into a hypervisor. So, but that being said, I do appreciate that Microsoft is trying to move this forward. What I don't really appreciate is that the rest of their note on best practices is basically motherhood and apple pie. It says you should have a business continuity plan, you should back up data, you should ensure that you can restore quickly. One of the things that they suggest is utilizing deployment rings, essentially to manage the rollout by slowing the roll of new software updates. Well, that's all well and good, but as we discussed with regard to CrowdStrike a few weeks ago or last week, you're trusting a service provider to do the right thing here, you actually need this rapid response. That's the whole point of CrowdStrike. You need rapid response and rapid updates to avoid exploits. I don't know that it really is the customer's responsibility to slow that roll if they're using a trusted partner. Now, I don't know if CrowdStrike should be your trusted partner, given what they did here, but that being said, we all have to trust somebody eventually. I'm not going to be able to fly the plane myself, and so I have to trust that they're going to do their job right. And when they don't do it right, then I have to switch to a different provider, I suppose. Yeah, a lot of Microsoft's recommendations are good, but no, this isn't really the full solution that it should be.
I like your analogy here, Stephen, about I have to trust somebody to fly the plane eventually, because it underscores the point that people are trying to make about this. You may be amazing at Microsoft Flight Simulator. Doesn't mean you can fly a passenger jet. Do you have access to just walk up there and say, hey, I'd like to fly this jet today? You do not, in fact. In fact, if you try to make a move towards that cockpit door, you're going to find out exactly how much access you have as you are currently kissing the carpet in the aisleway. That is how Microsoft should treat the kernel in Microsoft Windows. Everybody is locked out of the kernel. If you want access into the kernel, you must have these specific privileges and you've been audited and stuff like that. And before everybody wags a finger, Microsoft should be subject to those same restrictions as well. The Microsoft kernel team should be in like a big ivory tower inside of Microsoft. Nobody gets in without permissions, and you don't get to slip little things in to make Microsoft Word run a little bit faster. And if you don't believe that happened, I highly recommend you go read any Windows 3.1 book by Woody Leonhard, because they literally did that in the 90s. That's what almost got them broken up. In this notice, they talk a lot about zero trust. Zero trust works both ways. Just because the apps division needs slightly faster access to this memory location doesn't mean they should get it. Like, that's the whole reason that CrowdStrike failed, according to all the disassemblies that I've seen. It was bad programming on the part of people who were not sanitizing their programming environments. You cannot trust other developers to do the same things that you do. And if you want proof that Microsoft is not immune from this stuff, Azure went down this week for like 8 hours. And not only that, their DDoS protections amplified the problem. So these are a lot of interconnected systems that are working together, but one little problem takes the whole system down like a giant matchstick house of cards. The only way to combat this is to take the same page that, like you mentioned, Apple and Linux and other developers do, which is there are certain areas of the system which should be invalid. Nobody gets in ever. And if you want access, you work out of ring one and you have, calls into the system to do those things. That way, when a module crashes, doesn't take the whole system down. I mean, I look back at Ken Duda talking about this at Arista. Like, the reason why Arista systems were so resilient is because they don't let people into the operating system kernel like, at the time Cisco did. Cisco got smarter and decided not to do that. This is an ongoing problem. And I'll tell you why Microsoft has to have this. Because it's their legacy, right? Like, did you know that something like 88% of all crashes in Windows are actually caused by device drivers? Really? Because they have to support so much stupid hardware out there. And those device drivers have specific direct access needs. And that, honestly, is why your system has become more stable over time, is because Microsoft has slowly been ejecting those drivers out of the kernel, or they have been putting that hardware out to pasture. I mean, Windows 10 and 11 are actually fairly strict on their hardware requirements for that reason. But this is a consumer operating system that we're seeing this in. Enterprise operating systems have tools like CrowdStrike that absolutely have to have kernel access. And Microsoft needs to start working with these companies to figure out how to prevent this, how to keep this from happening in the future. Because if they don't, the next one's not just going to take down a whole bunch of endpoint systems. It's going to take down everything.
Yeah, it's a real challenge for these operating systems. I don't underestimate the amount of work that Microsoft has to do here to remedy this situation. So just to, kind of get back to it, as you mentioned, on x86 and ARM, there's different nomenclature, but essentially, let's say most privileged and least privileged. Some code runs in most privileged mode, right alongside the kernel, and some code runs in less privileged modes all the way up to user space, where basically any user can run anything they want. Apple, I have to say, in Mac OS has really been doing the right thing in order to move things out of the kernel. They have been griping about kernel extensions for a long time. If you had a Mac back in the old days using the big cat named versions of Mac OS 10, you probably remember that you had to install kernel extensions for things like SCSI, audio, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, etc., and that those things were frequently not well supported, not well updated, and often caused your system to crash, and that sucked. Apple moved everybody away from that to what they call system extensions. These are non-privileged, and they use open APIs that are documented by Apple in the operating system. It has taken Apple a decade to roll this out, and they're still not done. Even in the latest, greatest version of Mac OS, there are still, I think, 3 third-party kernel extensions that are allowed in the operating system for things like soft RAID, for example, that are really, really hard to abstract. But Apple has been abstracting them over time. They got networking out of there. They got USB. They got PCI Express, audio, Bluetooth, SCSI. All those things are pulled out of the kernel in operating release after operating system release over time. One of the key ones that they got out of the kernel was endpoint security. That's what we're talking about here. In fact, CrowdStrike Falcon, the software at issue here with the CrowdStrike bug, no longer runs as a kernel extension. It runs as a system extension on Mac OS and would not be able to crash the system because of the work that Apple did over that long of a time. The problem is that Microsoft is at the beginning of that path to some extent. Now, they've been trying to encourage people to get things out of the kernel, and that has been modestly successful. But the problem is they haven't put the hammer down like Apple did and said, no, guess what? No more endpoint security can run in the kernel, and I don't care if that breaks your product. And Microsoft has been always it's a bigger platform with a much bigger ecosystem, and they've always been willing to let people kind of ignore their guidelines in order to maintain backward compatibility. So Microsoft's move here in moving this stuff to a VBS, which is, as I said, a virtual environment that would have an API that would allow you to do things like endpoint security in a virtual container that would have to be signed and so on. I think that's a good practical way to maintain compatibility with this broad range of third-party software while also isolating it somewhat from the kernel. But it really isn't ultimately going to be the solution. Ultimately, they're going to have to do the same thing that Apple is doing, which is to say, no, we have APIs, and this is how you interact with the kernel. Now, one of the big questions here is, what about Microsoft itself? Would they be able to write things that run in kernel privileged level? I will say that they really ought not to. It's really a bad idea to do that with your software. As Apple found out a few years ago when they accidentally released an update to Mac OS that managed to kill most Macs with an Ethernet port. They basically CrowdStriked themselves back in 2016 because they issued their own faulty kernel extension. They quickly fixed it, but it was a big hassle for people that were affected by it. And those kind of hassles are going to come anytime you're doing something that is inherently insecure, like running things in kernel mode. So I would say that what Microsoft needs is they need to take this moment seriously. They need to have basically a kernel mode czar within the company walking around and saying, no, 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 you can't do this. You saw what happened with CrowdStrike. We've got to stop doing this in order to make sure that the entire world is safe from another CrowdStrike happening.
And I'll leave you with this thought. If Microsoft gets all of their stuff out of the kernel and plays by the same rules as all the other third parties that they do business with, I bet you the EU would actually applaud them for that, because that's the whole reason why that ruling came down in the first place, is that having unfettered access to something that other people don't is kind of a monopoly situation. So maybe Microsoft will learn their lesson. I hope that we will see. And you know that as they do, we will definitely be covering it here on the Rundown and at other events that we have coming up throughout the year. And Stephen, you're a busy man for the next few weeks. Why don't you tell us what you've got going on?
Yeah, Tom, I decided, why don't I just handle all the events for a while and let you take a little bit of the summer off? No, I'm kidding, of course. Tom is working hard on planning more of his events, and he just hosted Networking Field Day. Now, we're headed to Kansas City for the Share Conference next week. We're going to have presentations from mainframe-related companies on things like DevOps and Gen AI. No kidding. We've got Pop-Up Mainframe that does mainframe on demand. We've got Broadcom, which is a company you may have heard of that is big in the mainframe DevOps space. And we've got BMC software coming in there talking about open telemetry and things. So do check that out. We're going to be live streaming on August 6th at Tech Field Day and TechStrong TV. After that, we're going to be back with AI Field Day on September 11th through 13th. That's right. This is going to be as big an event as we've had with a ton of AI companies. We've announced in Fabrica and Elastic, and we expect to be announcing some big names soon. We're also going to be having another Edge Field Day event coming up later in September, the 18th and 19th. We've got some cool edge-focused companies like Zedata, OnLogic, which has been a lot of fun to get to know them, T-Second, which really impressed me. And we've got also an AI data infrastructure field day event coming as well, where we're going to learn about the infrastructure that supports AI applications. Plus, there's a lot more Tech Field Day events coming after that. Take a look at techfieldday.com and learn more.
I want to thank you all very much for watching this week's episode of the Gestalt IT Rundown. Remember that our new episodes come out every Wednesday in the afternoon on our YouTube channel, as well as your favorite podcast platform. You can also see it streaming on TechStrong TV, as well as other properties of theirs. And you can catch us on some of the things that they do, like TechStrong Group or some of the other Futurum Group productions. We will be back Wednesday next week to talk more about the news that has been going on. And until then, make sure that you tune into all of our great content, whether it's Gestalt IT or Tech Field Day or the Futurum Group. And make sure you leave comments. We love to hear what you have to say and get your perspective on things. But until next week, take care of yourselves, stay cool, enjoy the summer. We will see you soon.